Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this snowy Thursday. Welcome to today's webinar titled Water World, Preparing for Floods and Cleanup. My name is Brett Worth, Director of Business Development, and I'll be your MC for the morning. Before we get into the presentations, I want to tackle a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone on the show today will receive a follow-up email that will contain the recorded version of today's webinar, along with a PDF version of the slide deck. CEUs will come in a separate email within a week. We will have a questions and answers section at the end of the webinar, but would certainly love to hear from you during the presentation. To do so, please type your question in the question box. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Mr. Charles Brenner and Ms. Jennifer Wolf. Charles is a Principal Materials Engineer and Vice President. Mr. Brenner has led numerous projects assisting water damage structures and materials due to floods and leaks. Joining him this morning is Jennifer Wolf, Senior Scientist. Jennifer has extensive experience in managing disaster relief environmental projects, contamination investigations and remediation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Charles.
Hi, everybody. Floods happen all the time. The small floods that you don't hear about are commonly things like pipe leaks or a backed up sewer or a broken fire sprinkler that'll flood out a couple stories of a building. And then, of course, there's the large area-wide floods that do typically make the news. So for today, I thought it'd be useful to go through a case study of the Minot flood back in 2011. This was not a classic spring flood. The spring snow melt had already happened that year, and this actually happened in June. And what happened was there was just a terrific rainstorm in Saskatchewan, where the Souris River originates. The river then dips down into North Dakota and then continues back up into Canada. So that terrific rainstorm filled up the river, and there was some warning that the flood was heading their way. And Minot had flood control levees, and they were prepared based on past floods. The one as far back as 1881, the crest was an elevation of 1,558 feet. And then there was another one in 1969 that was more within people's memory of 1,555. However, this 2011 flood was far more than either of those. It was almost 4 feet more than the historic 1881 flood. And as a result, the levees just weren't tall enough to hold it. Fortunately, they had some warning coming. They were able to evacuate the neighborhoods along the river. But this image is showing one of those flooded neighborhoods. Once the river had overtopped the levees and flooded it out. And here's a look again at the Ward County map. So if you look at the dark blue winding line, that's the original path of the river, and the wider blue shows how the river was flowing, and the little dots and lines are the streets and homes and buildings. So it was basically going through the heart of the city, a very major area flood indeed. So then once the water goes down, the task is to assess the extent of the damage. And first question is, can a building be rebuilt? And in some cases, it's pretty clear if a building's collapsed or is really grossly damaged, it just probably can't be rebuilt. The next question is, should a building be rebuilt? And then that's more a matter of, okay, the building could be rebuilt, but is the damage such that the cost of repairs are approaching that of a new building, in which case you probably would be better off starting over and moving to higher ground. So our work, we were working with the Krause Anderson general construction firm assessing school buildings in Minot, and we were itemizing the damages and identifying the areas that were damaged versus the areas that weren't. And the general contractor, Krause Anderson, was then costing those out. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, was giving aid to that repair process. And what their architects and engineers were also on the scene. So we each worked independently, making our assessment of what was damaged and what the relative costs were. And in this case, FEMA's further criteria was if the building was less than 50% of its value in damage, that they would aid in the repair. It was more than 50%, there would still be aid, but the building would need to be demolished and moved.
And I would like to point out, this is Jennifer Wolf, I'd like to point out that HUD has a different level for that. So they usually say if the cost to repair or the cost to replace is more than 75% of the cost to replace, that they want you to just replace rather than repair. I mean, there's ways around this as a historic building or whatnot, but they have different levels.
And HUD would apply to apartment buildings or something like that?
Well, it could apply for anything. The funding that will come through the disaster proclamation by the president could include school districts, houses, apartment buildings, commercial buildings, whatever.
Okay, but as long as HUD was
As long as
funding.
HUD's involved, right? Yep.
Okay. So next several slides will be from our assessment process. This is looking down. Yeah, it's kind of hard to even imagine what you're seeing here, but this is looking down a row of classrooms. So this is a lot like the school classrooms I remembered. And what's missing here are the partition walls between. So each classroom had windows in the front and the back, and there was partition walls in between. So what had happened here was the flood waters had rushed through and knocked out the partition walls between the classrooms. Anytime you have flooding, besides the water damage, mold is a concern. The flood waters are soaking up building materials, especially gypsum board, wallboard, commonly called drywall, which has paper facing. And then if that stays wet for a long time, it's prone to growing mold. The other thing to keep in mind is flood waters are, of course, very dirty. They've got sediments, runoff. The local water treatment plant has been flooded and so forth. So you've got a lot of dirty water contacting paper and sitting a while. So this the upper photo is wallboard, and then the lower right-hand corner was actually a gypsum ceiling panel. And although that wasn't inundated, there was evidently enough splash that took out the ceiling tiles from the ceiling grid, and then splashed up onto that gypsum and got mold growing there. An industrial hygienist should be consulted in the case of a severely flooded building too, because there can be, this was pretty obvious, but there can be more subtle places where maybe mold is growing inside a cavity wall that you can't see it. And again, an industrial hygienist can help you diagnose that. Something else that happened here was damage to fixtures. You can see the row of lockers there that are basically pushed in and from their proper alignment. Likewise, there's an emergency exit door. I think that was on the gymnasium that's basically been blown out by the water. A lot of damage to mechanical and electrical systems. In this case, we're looking down into a basement pit where there were boilers, and those were thoroughly inundated and basically wrecked. And you know, it's not feasible to move great big boilers, but some of these schools also had their phone and their file server rooms down in basements, which probably was convenient and certainly would be good if there was a tornado, but it was real bad for a flood.
And in some cases, when you are using HUD funding to rebuild, all those critical systems, including the boiler, do have to be moved up above the base flood elevation. So it can be done on a building by building basis. You'd have to talk to somebody like that to see how you could do it, but they don't want these areas to be prone to flooding, have the critical stuff. And that includes also like your elevator equipment, in addition to your backup servers and power generation, heat, stuff like that.
Right, and as long as this thing was wrecked, I mean, if this building would have been repaired, that would have been the opportunity to move it. I was just meaning that there was no moving it in the 5 days warning that they had that it was coming.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Here's a few more slides. The upper left picture is where there was entrance doors, and again, the rushing water blew it out, and then also caused a localized roof collapse. So a note of caution: when a building has been flooded, don't just rush in there. Have an engineer or a building contractor, somebody assess it to see what parts are safe to go into, and of course that part was not safe for anyone to go into a partial collapse. And then on the right, there's a window system where you see some broken glass panes. That again, that window system was meant to withstand a certain amount of wind pressure, but not a river current. Likewise, it's not too visible from the picture, but it was more so in person. It wasn't just a matter of replacing the glass, because the metal frames were actually badly bent and distorted. Another thing that happened at this school is what we call racking of the structure. So there's, again, uneven pressure that the building wasn't meant for. You've got the water current, and what we could see is that it caused the whole building to move. So you've got the steel frame that's moving with respect to its gypsum wall panels. So besides the mold problems, you're basically losing some structural integrity from this racking movement. So the outcome of all this is of the 3 schools that we assessed, 2 of them were demolished and replaced on higher ground. They were past the 50% criteria in effect for that project. And then one of the schools was damaged, but not so severely, so it did make sense to restore it. And the city of Minot, since then, is in the process of improving their flood control through structural work, and they've got a very good website. And if you're interested, it's worth looking up the city of Minot and then on the flood control pages. And here's, again, just a sketch plan of a concept that they're building. Again, you can see the winding river path, so they're building structures along the way, both levees, and then of course you need temporary structures where things like roads cross. There have to be ways to close those off when a flood comes, and then open them up again so you can get across town. And then a further case was the Grand Forks floods back in 1997. We also worked on about 30 public buildings and schools in Grand Forks. And in that case, Grand Forks is also a river town similar to Minot. It's on the Red River of the north rather than the Souris, but river town built right up to the banks of the river historically. And again had levees for their historic floods, and again the 97 flood was much worse than had ever happened historically. And they're taking a little different approach to repairs. They're certainly building some flood structures, but they're also turning some of those really badly damaged neighborhoods into green space, and But by virtue of doing that, you can do you trade some land and do less structural work. There's also a bypass being done, but this was something that could be done fairly quickly. The things like bypasses take many years to do.
Well, thank you, Charles. Next up is Jennifer Wolf. She will be speaking on the environmental aspects associated with disaster relief.
Awesome, thank you. So what I want to talk about is after the flood or your other disaster has happened. So here's a picture from flooding that happened due to Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy was, everybody calls it sort of like the perfect storm, if you will. For those of us who don't live on the ocean, you know, there are tides, obviously, but there are also historic high tides. And once every 10 years or so, there are tides that are historically higher than your typical high tide. Hurricane Sandy, which was also one of the largest hurricanes to hit the U.S., hit right at one of those historic high tides. So that sort of combined effect of an already high tide with a very large storm caused flooding even in areas that wouldn't normally get even from just the storm itself. So what I want to talk about today is, you know, what happens after that point? How do you help the community recover? We're going to talk about creating an action plan, some elements for success, and then because, you know, I do environmental review, we're going to talk a little bit about that and some things to consider as you're moving forward. So as we said, what I'm talking about is, you know, the disaster's already occurred. So in the upper photo here, you see, you know, flooded streets. Presumably some of the buildings are also flooded. Whereas down below, you're looking at, you know, a pretty widespread damage. And your approach to those two different areas may vary based on what the community needs and what the damage was. So the first thing that happens after, you know, federal disaster declaration is to create some sort of action plan. And the purpose of the action plan is to lay out how the community is going to recover from this. So you're going to lay out what the impact of the natural disaster is. So for example, for Hurricane Sandy, they were talking about, you know, the high tides and the storm. For Hurricane Harvey, they were talking about all the rain and how the storm stalled over Texas for so long, which magnified the flooding that we had in that area. So then you're going to talk about the purpose and the need for the action. You're going to talk about how many neighborhoods were impacted, how many businesses, how many roads, school systems, all of those things need to come together. You talk about what types of people have been impacted. Is it, you know, all one neighborhood or spread throughout? And then here's where it gets really tricky. You have to talk about what do you want to do to recover? So what kind of programs are you going to develop for your neighborhood? And things that you could consider, for example, is maybe you're only going to do infrastructure. Maybe the damage is worse to like roads and bridges and things like that. So you're only going to focus on that. Or maybe it's the schools, maybe it's commercial businesses, residences, apartment buildings. All of those things have to be considered. One of the things that I would recommend as you're doing your action plan is to include your environmental and your financial and engineering staff into your planning and program discussions, because there are, especially for environmental, there are requirements on what you have to do for your review that will vary based on what kind of programs you are developing. So for example, I was working on Hurricane Sandy, and after they're further along, they realized that they hadn't included in their action plan flood walls, which are pretty common on the East Coast, especially in Long Island area, and they hadn't included repairing flood walls or putting in flood walls in areas where they hadn't existed before. So they actually had to go back and tweak their action plan to include that. So then the last point that your action plan needs to cover is how the funding is going to be dispersed. I mean, how are you planning on doing all this? Who's going to take the applications? Who's going to run them? How long will you accept application? All of these things take time. So I would recommend while you're writing your action plan or thinking about your action plan, get the rest of your team set up. Start looking for contractors, start looking for financial, environmental, engineering. All those people have to be together so that you can start working forward as soon as the action plan's been approved.
Jen, you mentioned flood walls. Were some of those communities places where water had come in before, but this was just way more than?
Absolutely, there were a lot of that. And there were some communities that came to the state in New York and asked them to be bought out because the whole neighborhood was so damaged and had been historically that they just decided they didn't want to deal with it anymore. They were done. There was one neighborhood, it's called the Oakwood Beach neighborhood, and 370 of the 400 homeowners asked the state to buy them out because I think 300 houses were destroyed just in the flooding, and the other remaining houses were very badly damaged. So one of the decisions that was made in the action plan is, yeah, we will allow neighborhoods to come to us and ask to be bought out.
So Jennifer, we have a question that's come in. Who performs the environmental or financial reviews that you mentioned?
Well, that's something that was also discussed in the action plan, and so it will really vary. So in most cases, the state or whoever's dispersing the funding would like to see that they do the reviews because they want to make sure they're done correctly. Because if you don't do the reviews correctly, HUD or FEMA can come back and take back the money, even if you already spent it. And that is something nobody wants to have happen. So in those cases, the state usually sets up a process, and they usually hire contractors or teams of contractors that they would have. Great question, thank you. So what I want to, so specifically here we're talking about the environmental review because that's, like I said, my area. The environmental review has to be completed before you can give them the money, and that can delay your process as well. Remember, these people are already out of their houses or their houses are damaged, and to have to hold up for somebody to tell them that there's no endangered species seems like a big hassle. But you don't want to have your repair actions or your recovery actions harm the environment more than has already been harmed by the flooding itself. So if there's a wetland in the area, you want to make sure that the homeowners or the business owners or the school district aren't impacting that wetland area that's been impacted. So the format of the review is determined by the source of the funding, so it varies by how fast or how easy it is. Financial reviews are also required, and these are the things that, so when HUD comes in, they want to talk about what they call the unmet need, which means that if you have funding that you got from your insurance company or from FEMA, or like maybe the community had a potluck and all the people whose houses were damaged got some of the proceeds from their little fundraising potluck, that actually counts against you as well and has to be documented. And so keeping all that paperwork can be really hard because you're in the middle of trying to recover, and all of a sudden you have to remember that your neighbor gave you $50. But yes, you do have to remember all that, because as I said before, if any of these steps are done wrong or they're missing, FEMA or HUD can come back and take back the money. And some of the things that people don't think about is the reimbursement. So for the state of New York, for example, they decided that because the reviews were taking so long, they realized that people were going ahead and fixing their houses, which is what, obviously you'd want them to do. So they would allow reimbursement applications, which would be people could come and say, hey, I just spent $20,000, moving my boiler to the roof. I want you to pay me back. That's all great. And it was a nicely thought out program, and it was laid out in the action plan. But what we had to explain to all the applicants is that if you enter that reimbursement program, you actually had to stop all work if you were in the middle of it until the review is complete, and then you could finish your work. So there was some communication that the state then had to make sure that people understood that, yes, we have the reimbursement program, and yes, you're eligible, but we recommend that you not apply to either you're at a good stopping point or you've already completed your work. So kind of wrap up a little bit here. You want to move quickly. Disaster relief is, it's hard on the community, obviously. They just had this major disaster, and it's hard on the people who have to do it. It's one of the things that I was always telling my team, just remember that every review you're doing is a person, and it is their review. Get it done quickly so that they can get back in their house or back in their business. And we want those schools back up and running. We want those businesses back up and running. If like a grocery store got inundated with salt water, we want to get them new food for them to sell so that people in the neighborhood can get food. You want to be thinking of all that while you're doing it. There are some shortcuts. Shortcuts isn't maybe the right word. Some ways of doing things more efficiently that you could think about while you're working on your action plan. And that is like to do a review on a statewide or a countywide level. And that allows you to complete a whole lot of reviews pretty fast. It takes a while to do the big review, but you can do that in a couple months, and then every little review takes a lot less time.
That reminds me, in both Minot and Grand Forks, the schools, getting the schools assessed so that the kids could go back to school and have one thing back to normal was a very big deal for both of those communities.
Absolutely, it's a huge thing in disaster relief. You want to the goal is to get things back to normal as quickly as possible, and to that end, having a well thought out action plan or making some agreements with other agencies like the Fish and Wildlife or the State Historic Preservation Officer to streamline your review so you can get it done quickly. So a couple things to finish is, one is that programs that are well thought out in the beginning will have fewer issues later. Get your team laid out, get your action plan laid out, solicit information from the community. And one of the things that I would recommend to people who are like in a disaster area or think that they're going to be hit with a disaster, is the first thing that you can do is help your elected officials understand what needs to be done. If you're seeing that you and your neighbors have enough funding to build, but the road is awful, make sure that's what you tell your representatives so they can make that action plan fit you. And then, as I said, Ramon, all the projects is about helping people recover from a natural disaster. Like Chuck says, the goal is to get people back in their houses, the business is running, the roads working, the schools up and running, so that you can get back to where you were before the disaster.
So Jennifer, we had one more question come in here for you. The question, can I do the reviews on my own, or should I go through the state agencies / guidelines?
Well, and we actually had that come up a couple different times. You have to see what the state allows, but it comes down to timing. If you need, everybody needs it fast. It's a disaster, I get that. But if you are able to wait for the state to go through it, it's typically done at no cost to you, and that would be better for you, obviously. But there could be times when you feel that the state or the county isn't going to be, if you don't feel like they're going to be able to do the review in the time frame that fits your rebuilding, then definitely I would talk to the state about doing it yourself. And they usually allow for that sort of process.
One question has trickled in here during your response. Do all subcontractors need to be registered or approved by FEMA?
Well, FEMA does have some approval process. It's not something that you need to go through. They really have more, they want to make sure that you're qualified in general. The state or the county or the funding agency typically has more requirements than FEMA.
And that's why I remember as well, I think they were state licensed contractors in North Dakota.
Yeah, usually they have to be state or municipal authorized rather than FEMA itself.
Well, if anyone else has any questions, please type them in, and we certainly can answer those. But I thank you for attending today's webinar. Just as a reminder, we will be sending out an email shortly after the webinar containing the recording of today's presentation. CEUs will be delivered in a separate email to participants within a week. So please keep your eyes on your mailbox for future webinars. And if any additional questions do come to mind, please don't hesitate to email them to either Charles or Jennifer, or simply visit our website. So with that, I'm not sure if it's possible to have a great day today given the weather, but we can certainly try. Thanks again.